Kurt Cobain walked into the management office in Seattle with a proposal that would either save his sanity or destroy his career. It was April 1993, and Nirvana was at the peak of their commercial success. They could sell out stadiums anywhere in the world. And Kurt wanted to play in garages instead. The meeting had been called to discuss the upcoming tour schedule. Nirvana's management had mapped out an ambitious plan, 40 stadium shows across North America and Europe, each venue holding between 30 and 60,000 people. It was the kind of tour that most bands spent their entire careers dreaming about. Kurt was about to tell them he'd rather quit. John Silva, Nirvana's manager, spread the proposed tour schedule across the conference table like a treasure map. "Look at this, Kurt. Break time 05s. We've got confirmed holds on every major stadium from Seattle to New York. Madison Square Garden wants 3 nights. The Hollywood Bowl is begging for a show. This tour could gross $40 million. Kurt stared at the schedule without touching it. His blonde hair was falling across his face, and he was wearing a cardigan that looked like it had been through a war. To everyone in that room, he should have been excited. Instead, he looked like he was being shown his own death warrant. "What if we didn't do stadiums?" Kurt said quietly. The room went silent. John Silva looked up from the schedule. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if instead of playing to 50,000 people in stadiums, we played to 500 people in clubs, or 100 people in basements? What if we just went back to the way we used to do it? Break time, equal 5s. Danny Goldberg, another member of the management team, laughed nervously. "Kurt, you're joking, right? You can't be serious about turning down stadium tours." "I'm completely serious." John Silva sat back in his chair, studying Kurt's face. "You want to explain what you're thinking here?" Kurt took a breath. "Every time we play a stadium, it feels like we're playing to nobody. The people in the front rows are too far away to see their faces. The people in the back are so far away they're watching us on video screens. It's not a concert anymore. It's just a spectacle. I didn't get into music to be a spectacle. That spectacle pays your bills," Danny pointed out. "That spectacle made you famous." "I never wanted to be famous," Kurt shot back. "I wanted to make music that connected with people. But how am I supposed to connect with someone who's watching me on a screen from 300 yards away?" John Silva leaned forward. "Kurt, I hear what you're saying. But you need to understand the business side of this. We've got contracts with venues, commitments to promoters, sponsors lined up. We can't just cancel 40 stadium shows and book garage concerts instead. Why not?" "Because it's insane," Danny said flatly. "Because you'd be throwing away millions of dollars. Because your record label expects you to support the album with a major tour. Because this is how successful bands operate." What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments in Nirvana's history. Kurt stood up and walked to the window overlooking downtown Seattle. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Break time, 05s. Then he turned around and spoke in a voice that was quiet but completely firm. "I'll make you a deal. You book 20 small shows, clubs that hold less than 1,000 people, basements, warehouses, record stores, anywhere that feels real. If those shows don't work, if people don't show up, if it's a disaster, then I'll do your stadium tour. But if they work, if people connect with the music the way they used to, then we do the whole tour in small venues." "That's not how this works," John said. "Kurt, the infrastructure doesn't exist to do what you're talking about. How do you decide who gets tickets when you've got 10 million fans and 500 seats? Lottery system. First come, first served." "I don't care. Figure it out. But I'm not playing another stadium unless you give me a chance to prove that small shows work better." "5s?" Danny Goldberg shook his head. "The label will never approve this. Geffen expects a stadium tour. They've budgeted for a stadium tour. They're not going to let you play in basements." "Then I guess we're not touring," Kurt said. "Because I'm not doing stadiums anymore. I can't. It's killing me." The silence in that room was thick enough to cut. Kurt's management team exchanged glances, trying to figure out if he was bluffing or serious. Kurt just stood by the window, waiting. Finally, John Silva spoke. "You're really willing to walk away from $40 million because you don't like big venues? I'm willing to walk away from $40 billion if it means I can play music the way it's supposed to be played. In a room where I can see people's faces, where they can feel the music instead of just watching it on a screen." Break time, .05s. What followed was 3 weeks of tense negotiations. Nirvana's management tried every argument they could think of. The financial implications were staggering. The logistical challenges were immense. The legal complications with promoters and venues were nightmarish. But Kurt wouldn't budge. Geffen Records was furious. They'd invested millions in Nevermind and expected a stadium tour to recoup that investment and promote the next album. The idea of Kurt playing to 500 people at a time instead of 50,000 seemed like commercial suicide. But Kurt had leverage they couldn't ignore. He was Nirvana. Without him, there was no tour at all. And he'd made it clear he wasn't bluffing. In the end, a compromise was reached. Nirvana would do a limited tour of unconventional venues, mixing small clubs with a few larger shows. Break fives. If the experiment failed, Kurt agreed to honor some of the stadium commitments. If it succeeded, the management would acknowledge that there were other ways to tour besides the traditional arena circuit. The announcement sent shockwaves through the music industry. Nirvana, one of the biggest bands in the world, was abandoning stadiums to play in clubs and warehouses. Music critics called it everything from brilliant to insane. Promoters thought it was a publicity stunt. Fans were confused but intrigued. The first show of the experimental tour was at the OK Hotel in Seattle, a venue that held about 300 people. Getting tickets was nearly impossible. Over 100,000 people registered for the lottery. The 300 who won felt like they'd hit the jackpot. Break time, Euro 5s. Kurt walked onto the tiny stage at the OK Hotel and looked out at an audience close enough to touch. He could see individual faces. He could see people's expressions change as the music hit them. For the first time in years, he felt like he was actually playing for people instead of performing for a crowd. The show was electric in a way that stadium concerts could never be. The intimacy of the space meant every note mattered. Every lyric landed with weight. The audience wasn't passively watching. They were part of the experience, pressed close to the stage, breathing the same air as the band. After the show, Kurt found his management team backstage. His face was flushed with excitement in a way they hadn't seen in months. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. That's what music is supposed to feel like." John Silva, Break Time equals 05s, who'd been skeptical from the beginning, had to admit that something special had happened. "I've never seen you that energized after a stadium show." "Because stadium shows feel like work," Kurt said. "This felt like why I started playing music in the first place." The tour continued through small venues across the Pacific Northwest and California, an old movie theater in Portland, a warehouse in San Francisco, a record store in Los Angeles where the band set up in the middle of the aisles and fans sat on the floor. Each show was an event, a once-in-a-lifetime experience for the lucky few who got in. But something unexpected was happening. The exclusivity of the shows was actually building Nirvana's mystique rather than diminishing it. Fans who couldn't get tickets were more desperate than ever to see the band. Break time, 5s. The media coverage of the small shows was more intense than any stadium tour would have generated. Music publications were calling it revolutionary, a rejection of arena rock excess in favor of punk rock authenticity. Danny Goldberg, who'd initially opposed the idea, started seeing the commercial potential. "You know what's interesting? The demand for Nirvana tickets is higher now than it was when we were booking stadiums. The scarcity is creating value." "That's not why I'm doing this," Kurt said sharply. "I'm not trying to create artificial scarcity. I'm trying to play music that feels real." "I know," Danny said. "But the side effect is that you're more culturally relevant now than you were filling stadiums. People are paying attention in a different way." The experiment reached its peak with a show at a small club in Olympia, Break Time, So 5s, Washington, the town where Kurt had spent years struggling before Nirvana broke through. He'd specifically requested to play there at a venue called the Capitol Theater that held fewer than 200 people. "This is where it started," Kurt told his band before the show. "This is what it felt like before everything got huge and weird. I just want to remember what that was like." The Olympia show became legendary. Kurt played with an intensity and vulnerability that reminded everyone why they'd fallen in love with Nirvana in the first place. He covered songs by local bands that had influenced him. He told stories about playing terrible shows in the same building years earlier. He made music feel human again. After Olympia, Nirvana's management had to acknowledge that Kurt's instinct had been right. Break Time E.05s, the small venue tour wasn't hurting the band's career. If anything, it was enhancing it. But the compromise still held. Some larger venues were on the schedule, including a few festival appearances that Kurt had reluctantly agreed to. The contrast between the small shows and the large ones was stark. At Reading Festival, in England, playing to tens of thousands of people, Kurt looked uncomfortable and disconnected. 2 nights later, at a tiny club in London, he was electric and present. The difference was visible to anyone paying attention. Music journalists started writing about the phenomenon. Kurt Cobain had exposed a truth that the industry didn't want to acknowledge. Bigger wasn't always better. Sometimes intimacy created more impact than spectacle. Break time, 05s. Sometimes 100 people in a basement could generate more genuine connection than 50,000 people in a stadium. Other alternative bands took notice. Pearl Jam started incorporating smaller venues into their tours. Radiohead experimented with unconventional spaces. The idea that success meant playing the biggest venues possible was being challenged. But there was a cost to Kurt's approach that wasn't immediately obvious. By limiting audience sizes, Nirvana was leaving millions of dollars on the table. For a band at their level, choosing to play to hundreds instead of thousands was essentially donating money to the concept of artistic integrity. John Silva sat down with Kurt after a show in San Diego. "We need to talk about the financial reality here. You know I support what you're doing, but the band has expenses. Break time equals 05s, the crew needs to be paid, and playing to 300 people at a time isn't sustainable for a band of Nirvana's size." Kurt's response was simple. "Then maybe Nirvana shouldn't be the size we are. Maybe we got too big too fast, and this is my way of bringing it back to something manageable." "You can't shrink a band," John said. "You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Nirvana is huge whether you play stadiums or basements." "Maybe not," Kurt said. "But I can control where I play and how I play, and I'm choosing to play in places where music feels like it matters." The small venue experiment continued through the spring and summer of 1993, running parallel to the recording of In Utero. The combination of intimate live shows and an abrasive, Breaktime 05's, uncommercial album seemed to be Kurt's way of resisting everything that mainstream success had turned him into. Looking back, music historians see this period as Kurt's most desperate attempt to reconcile his success with his values. He couldn't make Nirvana small again, but he could choose to perform in small spaces. He couldn't undo Nevermind's popularity, but he could refuse to act like a stadium rock star. The small venue shows proved something important, that Kurt Cobain's power as an artist wasn't dependent on spectacle or production value. Strip away the big stages and the massive crowds, and what remained was a songwriter of extraordinary talent, connecting directly with people through music. Kurt Cobain was offered stadium tours worth millions of dollars. He chose garages and basements instead. The music industry called it career suicide. Kurt proved it was the only way to save his soul.